what was it that sprouted the interest of the Jewish people in this area of Palestine? If we go back to 1901, there was a Jewish banker by the name of Mitzray Krasol, and there were two other Jewish influential leaders who had come to Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was the leader of the Muslims at that time. And these people came to offer Sultan Abdul Hamid paying all the debts of the Uthmani Caliphate, building the navy of the Ottoman state, and also giving 35 million golden liras without interest to support the prosperity of the Uthmani Caliphate. And this is quite significant because at that time, the Uthmani Empire was actually under a lot of debt because of the predecessors of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And he was, to a certain extent, his hands were tied in terms of developing the empire because of all these debts that he prioritized to pay back. And the banker and the other influential leaders from the Jewish side, they had offered all of this to Sultan Abdul Hamid II in exchange for allowing the Jews to visit Palestine anytime they wanted and to stay as long as they wanted to visit the holy sites, to allow the Jews to build settlements where they live, and they wanted them to be located near Jerusalem. Why did they want all of this? Well, historically, the Jewish people living in Europe were quite unwanted, and they were persecuted, and they wanted to flee all of this. And they felt that a reasonable solution would be to form a homeland for themselves that they could call their own, their own state. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, he refused to even meet these people, and he sent them an answer through his right-hand man, Tahsin Pasha. And the answer was, tell those impolite Jews that the debts of the Uthmani state are not a shame. France has debts, and that doesn't affect them. Jerusalem became a part of the Islamic land when Khalifa Umar ibn al-Khattab took the city, and I'm not going to carry the historical shame of selling the Holy Lands to the Jews and betraying the responsibility and trust of my people. May the Jews keep their money. The Uthmanis will not hide in castles built with the money of the enemies of Islam. And he also told the Jewish people to leave and never come back to meet him again. However, despite that, the Jewish people didn't give up. And later on in the same year, the founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, visited Istanbul, and he tried to meet Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who also again refused to meet him. And Sultan Abdul Hamid II told his head of the Ministers' Council, advised Dr. Herzl not to take any further steps in his project. I cannot give away a handful of the soil of this land, for it is not my own. It is for all the Islamic Ummah. The Islamic Ummah that fought jihad for the sake of this land, and they have watered it with their blood. The Jews may keep their money and millions. If the Islamic Khilafah state is one day destroyed, then they will be able to take Palestine without a price. But while I am alive, I would rather push a sword into my body than see the land of Palestine cut and given away from the Islamic State. This is something that will not be. I will not start cutting our bodies while we are still alive. So I think that kind of shows us how important this land was, what the interest was from the Jewish people's side, and the response at that time of the Muslims leader, Sultan Abdul Hamid II. I think that's where we can start, inshallah, and then move on.
You talked about these delegations that came to Sultan Abdul Hamid during the last sort of phase of the Ottoman Caliphate, asking to allow settlements on this land. But these people that you've described, Theodor Herzl, he is what he described himself really as a Zionist. And they had a goal to achieve the ideology of Zionism. This isn't to do with Judaism, it's not to do with Islam, it's to do with an ideology called Zionism. So I really want to unpick this word. We often hear the word Zionism when discussing the subject of Palestine. It's used by Palestinian activists, it's used by people who want to show the oppression, the tyranny, the struggle. What exactly is Zionism?
So Zionism is a Jewish nationalist movement whose goal is the creation and support of a Jewish national state in Palestine. It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodor Herzl, who is an Austrian Jew. And the term Zionism itself, in the Hebrew Bible, Zion is used to refer to the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. When Herzl first came up with Zionism, initially not all Jews agreed with his goals of a Jewish state in Palestine. The majority of Haredi or strictly Orthodox Jews were opposed to Zionism because it was based on nationalism, or the idea of Jews as a race rather than a religious group. And the Haredi Jews were concerned that secular nationalism would redefine the Jewish nation from a religious community based on their alliance to God, for whom adherence to religious laws were the essence of the nation's task, purpose, and right to exist, transforming from that instead to an ethnic group like any other ethnic group. They were also of the view that it was forbidden for the Jews to reconstitute Jewish rule in Palestine before the arrival of the Messiah. And you asked also about what the aim of Zionism was, or what the aim of Zionism is, rather. And in the first Zionist Congress, back in 1897, Herzl stated his aims quite clearly. He said, "The aim of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law." Now, the term public law is generally understood to mean seeking legal permission from those who ruled over Palestine at the time, and in 1897 it was the Ottoman rulers. And as Samia mentioned, though Herzl went and approached the Ottoman Sultan, his proposal was refused. So simply put, Europe has a huge history of anti-Semitism. And when I say huge, I mean it goes back to the Middle Ages, like 1095. And this was largely influenced by the Christian belief that the Jewish people were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus, or Isa alayhi salam. They were persecuted and generally prejudiced against, things like, back in the Middle Ages, it was things like they had to wear badges signifying that they were Jewish people. They weren't allowed to own property. They were, generally blamed or thought of as crooked or evil people. And Britain was no stranger to anti-Semitism. The Jews were actually expelled in 1290 by Edward I and were not allowed to remain in England for over 350 years. And we're talking thousands of Jews here. And it wasn't until 1657, some 350 years later, when Oliver Cromwell came into power, that they were allowed to return. So fast forward to sort of 19th, 20th century Europe, the 1900s, and Europe was generally very, very racist in their worldview and belief. They had this idea of the superiority of the white race over other races. This was a time when eugenics started to become really popular, social Darwinism, this idea that it's in your DNA, whether you're a superior or inferior race. So all of these ideas becoming popular in Europe meant that the Jews were having a really tough time of it. They who were of non-European origin and had non-European cultures were considered a distinct and inferior race. And there are several documented examples in history of how this anti-Semitism manifested. So, for example, in Germany, they had the Hep Hep riots, where Jewish property and the people were damaged and attacked. There was the Dreyfus affair at the end of the 1800s, where basically in France, a man by the name of Alfred Dreyfus was accused of high treason, and it sparked a huge wave of anti-Semitism in France. He was later cleared of charges by 1906, but this didn't affect the fact that public perception of Jews was really, really poor. And then switching over to Eastern Europe for a moment, in 1905, there were huge anti-Jewish riots or pogroms in Russia that took place year on year, which killed about 2,000 Jews roughly, and it triggered a mass migration of roughly 1 million Jews to America and hundreds and thousands of Jews to Britain, seeking refuge from the persecution they were facing in Eastern Europe. But in 1905, again, not much had changed in the British view of the Jewish people, and they set up the Aliens Act of 1905 to control Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. This being the whole backdrop of everything, it became increasingly evident to Herzl, who is, as I've mentioned, an Austrian Jew, that Jews wouldn't be safe until they had a state of their own. and a place that they could settle in and defend. And over the years, interestingly, because I know we talk about now Herzl wanting to set up a Jewish state in Palestine, Palestine was not always the real estate of choice, I guess you could say, for the Jewish state. You know, countries like Uganda, Madagascar were also considered. But eventually, a lot of the Jews wanted to focus on Palestine because of the religious significance. Now, this was great as an idea. You know, if you think about the persecution they were facing, it's great as an idea to have a place where the Jews could be safe. But if you imagine a small targeted minority, there is no way these scattered Jewish people are going to be able to have the political strength, or strength in any other sense really, to decide, right, we're going to all up and move and migrate en masse to this other country on the other side of the world, and this is where we're going to call up home. You know, how are they realistically going to be able to do that? And there wasn't any way that he could have done without significant political backing, or, like, you know, somebody who had power in the world that was going to allow him to do this. So as we've already heard, he approached the Ottoman rulers and they said no. Herzl also actually approached the German Kaiser, who also said no. So the next person that he turned his attentions to was the British rulers. Herzl thought that the European leaders, or the British in particular, would help support Zionism for one of three main motives. Number one, imperialist self-interest, that the British would have something to gain if they helped them. Number two, British would then be rid of this problem of the Jews, as they call it, or the Jewish problem, and prevent, you know, influx of Jews from Russia to Britain. And number three, they could use that Jewish influence to combat any sort of problems in the area wherever they placed them down, or particularly here in this sense, Palestine. So it was a very strategic decision in the end.